So, hello,
Hello.
and thank you so much for doing this. How are you doing?
I'm good. Whoa. Childcare is, whoa, Jesus Christ. Childcare is complicated.
Yes, a lot of variables. I imagine. You got how many kids you got?
We have two. They are 2 and 5.
Oh wow,
This is
so
the high
young.
energy
Yeah.
stage.
That's wild. So you're balancing that, and you're are you currently you're a philosophy professor at the University of Utah.
Yep.
So are you still doing classes like right now?
Now, summer is research time. Summer is when I get to have the glorious time where I like actually read and actually think
Right.
and don't manage students for like 3 months of my life and like sink into a research project, which is what I'm doing right now.
Totally. How much of your teaching like how much of your day job is connected to the writing that you are clearly very passionate about with aesthetic philosophy?
Actually, like a huge amount of it. I mean,
Yeah.
if you cross between like the aesthetic stuff and the stuff on social epistemology, the stuff on trust and echo chambers, like a massive amount of that is what I teach about. Either I'm teaching specialist classes. The University of Utah has one of the world's biggest game design programs, and I'm
Oh,
now
okay.
teaching like aesthetics and philosophy of play there with my colleague who's a game designer, Jose Zagal. But yeah, so like I teach about a lot of the stuff I do is like either directly on this material or like right next door. Like I've been teaching this tech ethics class for computer science people, but a
Hmm.
lot of it's actually about like, the ethics of games and the ethics of urban design and the ethics of like how you create a space and the ethics, right? And that
Yeah.
stuff is like still part of all the stuff I do.
Interesting. Cool. Um, yeah, no, I've been really enmeshed in your work. I feel obliged to say like hello to you actually from my audience because I was introduced to you just off of like just a stray tweet that I made that was just like feeling very dissatisfied with most aesthetic philosophy I've read. Anyone got anything good? And then most people gave not good things. But one person was like where they were like, I don't really know much about stuff, but I'm a big fan of what Thi Nguyen says about stuff.
Yeah.
And so I checked you out and I read just it was the first thing was autonomy and aesthetic engagement
Oh yeah.
and I was like, okay. And then now the project I'm working on, because I don't know how familiar you are with like this genre of YouTube of like kind of pseudo educational media analysis. Um
Ish. A little bit.
oh, I guess you are actually, now I think of it, because you had that you were talking about the public philosophy and ContraPoints and stuff like that. So it's like
Yeah.
ContraPoints family stuff, you know?
Yeah. I
Um
know the realm.
right.
I'm like when I do public philosophy, I have spent my life as a writer. Like everything I do is about like slowly massaging words carefully on a screen. And
Yes.
so like that's the form I know best. But like I think what y'all are doing are awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's what's nice about it, to my view, not that like it's unilaterally all extremely high quality stuff, but
Yeah.
it's nice to see that there's signs of like a young audience that is really into like long form engaging with like something that's like real. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's what inspires me about it is like I can make a 2 hour video about philosophy and people will be like, hell yeah, because
And
that's
people
like,
watch it.
yeah, but
Yeah,
it's
no, this is the
sexy in this
amazing thing.
particular
Like
context. Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad that long form is still around. I have I like Twitter, but I have a lot of worries about the shortness of Twitter. And I
Yeah.
think part of the antidote to Twitter right now is both what you are doing and like both what long form podcasts are doing. Like I have this
Yeah. Yeah.
experience a lot of the times. Like I've been talking to journalists, and it's not just Twitter, it's like talking to journalists who are gonna put stuff I say in print. I'm very much on edge because I know what's going to happen is I'm going to talk for like 40 minutes and they're going to extract one sentence out of context. And it's probably going to be the most explosive and weird sentence. But like something like this, I can actually like talk.
Yes, of course. And there is also a lot of this. I mean, I've been going through a lot of your work, and then also, of course, like checking out like all of your, like your appearances on like Mindscape and your conversation with this British dude. I forget who, but I've seen some of your interview stuff, right? So you do. I've seen you do quite a bit of this as well, and you're very good at it, by the way. And like that live lecture that you have up about like the gamification of discourse and things like that. Like you're a very engaging speaker. So uh,
Thanks. I might let me see how things. So this is like something that you're recording and then gonna cut up, right? It's
yes.
not like okay, awesome. Give me a few minutes, and I might want a 5 minute break to make myself a coffee because
Totally
I
fine.
I think that you might get if I get a coffee in me, you might get a better interview. But give me a
Okay,
second.
okay. Can I just ask though, out of curiosity, like how much time you do have? Like if you have a cutoff you need?
Today I can talk for at least an hour, maybe a bit longer than that.
Cool. Yeah, that's
I don't
perfect.
have
That's
a
exactly.
sharp thing. I've got like I'm traveling tomorrow, so I have a billion things to get ready.
Right,
I'm
of course.
supposed to give a keynote for a conference in 2 days, and I haven't written it yet. So there's
Very
not a
good.
hard cutoff, but at some time I need to write an hour and a half long talk.
Of course. Yeah. So do you want to take your 5 minute coffee break right now?
Yeah, us do that.
Sure.
I think you'll get better tape if I'm
Excellent.
caffeinated.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
no problem at all. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be back in like 5 minutes.
Yep.
All right.
Hey.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Upstairs right now, there's just genuine raw glee and hysterical laughter because my 5 year old is obsessed with Minecraft.
Oh,
And we've discovered mods. We discovered that he has like no interest in any other toys. And so instead of like getting my other things, he gets like a Minecraft mod every like 3 or 4 days.
right.
And this morning he selected like the new TNT expansion pack,
Right.
which like gives him the ability to have like TNTs that explode like goats. And I just went upstairs and he's just like laughing maniacally and like running with glee as he's discovering like new kinds of Minecraft TNT. And like,
That's pretty cute. Well, do you ever play Minecraft with him?
I these days I have mostly I can't play Minecraft because one of the big problems for me with modern video games is whatever first person games. I have like this old car sickness, and first person games make me like sick to my gut. So I can't play those. My wife will play Minecraft with him. I can't. But mostly like I don't touch a lot of video games anymore because I know my weaknesses and I know what I'm addicted to. And I think like the technologies of addiction in certain kinds of games have just gotten better
Yeah.
and better and better. And like I can't touch them. Like I've never played a game like World of Warcraft because I know my weaknesses and I know like I would lose my job. Like
Yeah.
the thing that I found unbeatably like addictive about old school, top down computer role playing games has been amped up like to the max.
Uh-huh.
And I can just like see it, someone else playing out of the corner of my eyes. And I feel like an alcoholic passing a bar, like, give me that.
Yeah. That's pretty funny. You did talk about quite familiarly about Portal in the Art of Action, though. So you have done some first person
Yeah.
stuff.
I think it depends on like how, so Portal, I don't have to move that much. And so because Portal is puzzly and not like running around doing a ton of stuff, I can actually, but I play it like in a kind of laughable way. Like I move a little bit and then I have to look away, but I can like think about the puzzle
I was gonna say
and
that
look
sounds
away.
hilarious what you're describing. Like you're just in Portal, you take a quick little look around and then you sit in your mind and you think about
Right.
like a philosopher.
Right. But it's just like nausea. Like I was car sick my entire life, and like first person games have always screwed with screwed with whatever's going on. So most of them I can't play. Like my computer gaming for my entire youth was all like top down strategy games or
Right.
like just anything but first person.
Interesting. Okay. I want to get
So
through some of these questions since I don't want to take too much of your time, although I value speaking to you very much. I want to open with an easy one. What is art and prove it?
screw you, man. I don't have an answer to that question. I think that there's no art is one of the things that there's no clear single definition to. There are a lot of nearby notions and associations, and it's one of those terms that I think is a deeply contested term that, in some sense, I don't think is worth talking about. Like there are these two large pillars in philosophy in the parts that I do. One is the definition of knowledge, and the other is the definition of art. People have been running these questions for hundreds of years, and I've gotten like nothing from that conversation has ever seemed useful to me. And I think part of what's going on is that art turns out to not be a well-defined, clear concept. It's what philosophers will call like a cluster concept. It's a bunch of vague resemblances between a lot of different concepts that get bundled together. And so when someone asks whether something is art or not, I tend to try to separate the question out. to like its component parts and ask about like all these distinct. I mean, like if someone says like, are games really art? I think you can discompose this question and say like, okay, do you mean should we pay attention to them? Should the government fund them?
Mhm.
Should kids look at them in school? Like there's a bunch of nearby questions that I can actually get traction on. But starting with art, that's like, I think for a lot of people, when they ask, are games art? What they really mean is something like, is it worth my time? Like, am I? So one, I can't even remember this is in the. By the way, I should ask: have you read the games book? Just to.
I have not read the games book. I've
Okay.
read your latest three papers, a bunch of your public philosophy, and some of the sources within your things. Like I've been branching out into what
So
you reference.
just to know what you have in your head. So one of the. It was funny because when I was a kid, my mom thought that games were bad and books were good. Period. It didn't matter like what the game was. It didn't matter whether it was a complex game or a stupid game. Like games were by definition a waste of time,
Hmm.
and books by definition for her were good. Like it didn't matter if it was the trashiest, stupidest fantasy novel, right? Reading was good. And I think a lot of the times when my students like get really worked up over the question about are games art, what they really mean is it right that games are like an essentially lower order of way to spend your time,
Yeah.
or is there something like deeply valuable? And a lot of the times like art is the realm of the things we stick stuff in that realm when we find them like deeply valuable in a way we don't fully understand,
Hmm.
often when there's no clear outcome or product. But yeah, it's I don't find getting that term exactly right that important. Like
Okay.
what matters is the question of like, what do you get out of it? Is it similar to some mediums and different from others? Like what does it do for you and to you? What are the possibilities of games? These are questions that I think that we can work on and get our teeth into.
Mm. So a kind of similar question. So like I said, I read a bunch of your academic work now, and I've dug into several of your sources, and there's loads of rich, robust investigation into, like you said, the epistemology of aesthetic knowledge, if it exists, the difference between an aesthetic act and an instrumental act, and also where the value resides in an interaction with art, as like you deal with aesthetic engagement. But what I have yet to see is anyone specifically define aesthetics. Is this because what aesthetic means is so abundantly obvious to all of you that it's not even worth mentioning, or is it because you're trying to hide the fact you still don't know?
I think this is another one of these things where the term is fuzzy, right? There's a lot of different things it could mean to different people. And one way to approach the question is to say, well, we have to get the correct definition of this concept, and then we can move forward. And I don't think you actually need to do that. I think what you actually have are you have this word that people use in slightly different ways, and you just have to start a conversation by saying, um, here's the sense that we're using it. This is the part of it I care about. But a lot of the times, I feel like the stuff I'm doing is actually trying to work out what's special about this term, right? Like,
Hmm.
so, okay. So, so you can tell me if this is too technical, but one of the things that is interesting is so you've read some of my stuff and you know that I'm like obsessed with this question of why in aesthetic life. So let's start. When I say aesthetic life, and I vaguely gesture, people know generally what I mean, right? So we
Hmm.
can get like you're talking about beauty, you're talking about gracefulness, you're talking about horror, you're talking about the weird shit over there,
Hmm.
right? So we can get sort of on the same page. And then we can start to observe certain things about it. So the thing that I'm really interested in is the way that like conversations go differently in aesthetic life when you're talking about things like beauty or funniness. And the paper you're talking about, autonomy and aesthetic engagement, is like this weird obsession for me about how different aesthetic knowledge and aesthetic conversations are from the other stuff, right? So by aesthetic, I'll just start by like there's a cluster of terms that we all kind of put together: funny, beautiful, horrific. It's like the things we say about,
Hmm.
right? So but they all behave in a weird way, and one of the weirdest ways they behave is that it seems like you can get knowledge from deference to experts in the sciences, but you can't get knowledge from deference to experts in the aesthetic realm. So, I mean, so I think quick example, like I think it's totally fine for me to like trust my doctor that what I have is pneumonia, and trust my doctor that I should take amoxicillin, and I just take it, right? That is, I don't have to understand it for myself. I don't have to understand how amoxicillin works. I don't have to understand the diagnosis. I just can trust my doctor. Like that is a totally legitimate way to operate. And
Yeah.
the reason that's legitimate, the deep underground that I think is simmering behind a lot of the stuff I've been thinking about, is the fact that the world of science is too large for one human brain or even like 100 human brains, right? What it is to live in the world of science is to have to trust these massive, sprawling networks of experts. So Elijah Milgram, one of my favorite philosophers alive right now,
The Great
says
Endarkenment.
that, what'd you say?
I said the Great Endarkenment.
Yeah, that's the great endarkenment,
Yeah.
right? He says the easy way of putting it is the essential character of our era of living now is that every real piece of knowledge that we actually use is depends on such a vast sprawl of so many specialist domains linked together
Hmm.
that nobody even understands a tiny piece of it. Like no one understands everything you need to do to like for an airplane to fly, right? Like my wife is a chemist and she analyzes things constantly with this statistical tool. And I'm like, how much do you understand the statistical tool? She's like, I don't understand the statistical tool. Like the statisticians have published it. Like it's known as verified. Like I literally, she's like, it takes me like 15 years to become specialized on one instrument in chemistry. Like you don't have time to learn that other stuff, right?
Hmm.
So we have to live this way in the world of science. But in aesthetic life, things are very different. So the thing that is distinctive in aesthetic life that I find so interesting is the fact that we can't defer to experts. We think there's something wrong about just being like, I mean, I think part of the key idea is if if you have a friend who like just parrots back what the famous art critic says, right? Who's just and then when if you question them, they'd be like, "Well, what are you talking about? They're the experts. Like, why would I trust myself?" Like, I think the gut reaction is you want to shake them and say, like, "You're doing it wrong, right? There's something deeply wrong about what you're doing." So that little data point. I mean, so you asked what the aesthetic is. For me, it's interesting. I actually think that data point like might be a way to mark off the interesting realm, right? What makes this stuff interesting? What links it is that it's these weird properties that you have to see for yourself that you can't get from someone else,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So that's maybe the thing. That's what makes it interesting. By the way, I should say, if you want, I'm literally right now finishing the sequel to Autonomy and Aesthetic Engagement, which is an even bigger picture. We can talk about that view because it's like this massive.
I'm saving that for a little later because I'm really
Okay,
excited to ask you about it. But I just wanted to I want to get through some of the stuff that you already written first, of
right.
course. Um, but that didn't want that to interrupt the thought if you had a conclusion to it.
Oh no, so I mean, I should. Um, so by the way,
But if not,
side
don't worry.
note, I'm assuming that you understand this stuff, but it would be helpful for you if I explained it for your audience.
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
awesome. That's
It's also nice
um,
to hear it from you.
yeah. So So a lot of people end up saying something like, look, like, why is it that we can't know about art through testimony?
Mhm.
Um, and some people want to say something like, oh, it's because like whatever the aesthetic properties are, they're like totally subjective. You have to feel it for yourself. And other people want to say something like, oh, um, like you can never find experts you can really trust. But I think the way to actually understand it is that the reason we're not deferring to testimony is not because we can't find out about art through testimony and by trusting experts, but because it would be missing the point. That's not why we're at the museum or listening to music, right? We're doing it to be engaged in the process of listening or hearing for ourselves. So the analogy that I find really useful is to think of our life with appreciating art as something like a game, right? So a game is so Bernard Suits puts it this way: playing a game is voluntarily undertaking unnecessary obstacles for the sake of the activity they make possible, which is kind of a mouthful, but I find it one of the deepest mouthfuls. I mean, his idea is basically like, look, okay, I mean, one way to put it is that games involve essential inefficiencies, right? What you're doing when you play a game. So for him, games will include things like board games and video games and sports. So when you're running a marathon, the point is not just to be at the finish line. The point is to be at the finish line inside certain constraints, right? You, if you're running a marathon, you don't take a taxi, you don't call a Lyft, you don't rent like a little electric scooter, you don't take a bicycle. And the reason is that what it is to run a marathon is to run it with your own feet along a certain path. So one way to put it is that the constraints kind of shape the particular kind of activity. Um, I find myself sometimes the stuff I did on games happened in part because I ended up having a lot of arguments with people that didn't like that rejected what seemed to them like arbitrary rules. So if you're a rock climber, so the kind of rock climber I am is the general area is called free climbing. This is not the same as free soloing. So free climbing is you have a rope, you're clipping in your rope, right? But the rope is just there for safety. You don't ever pull on the rope. You don't pull on the gear that goes into the wall. You only advance up the rock using your hands and feet. So there's some people that look at this and they say like, this is totally arbitrary, right? This is silly. Why accept these rules? I'm a free person. I'm a creative person. Like, why would I ever submit myself to these arbitrary rules? The answer is actually really interesting. And I think like climbing made this really clear to me. So if you pull on the rope, so the rope is always there. And if you pull on the rope and if you pull on the things on the wall, then every climb is the same. Climbs turn boring, right? All a climb is going up a rope. It doesn't matter what the rock is like. All you're doing is climbing up the rope. But if you accept the restriction that you can't use the rope to go up, that it's only there for safety in case you fall, that makes you climb according to the particular features of the rock. And it means that every climb is different, right? That every climb involves these delicate acts of balance that you don't need to do if you're just pulling on the rope. So the interesting thing for me out of Suits's conception is that a game specifies an arbitrary goal that in some sense you don't really care about, like go to the top of this cliff, right? Rock climbers actually don't care about being at the top of the cliff in and of itself. Often there's an easier way up the back, but also when you make it to the top, you just immediately lower off, right? Right. So what's interesting is the adopted goal of getting to the top of the cliff, and then the restrictions: don't use ropes, don't use the easy path at the back, don't use a helicopter, right? Create this very specific activity of carefully climbing up rock, balancing, finding little details, shifting your body. And that's sculpted by the constraints. The rules of the constraints shape the activity. The next thing to think is that a lot of times, the reason we take up those constraints and pursue those goals is that we love being in the activity itself. We love absorption in the activity, right? I mean, one way to put it is that in normal life, the ends justifies the means, but in game life, often the means justifies the ends, right? Sorry. You adopt an end for the sake of the means, right? You try to get at the top for the sake of the struggle. So here's the thought. You could learn about art through testimony, right? Probably if I went and I don't know much about, let's say, Rococo painting, right? I know if I wanted correct judgment about Rococo painting, I should just trust an expert. I don't know shit about it. I wouldn't see anything, right? But it seems when something seems wrong, and my suggestion is that the wrongness there is just like buying some adventure puzzle game and then looking at the walkthrough, like buying Portal and then not trying to solve the puzzles for yourself and just going on line finding the walkthrough, of which we know there are thousands, right? And just following the walkthrough to get through the game. And what that makes, I think what that's seeing that's wrong in Portal exposes that the point of playing Portal is not to have finished the game, but to have gone through the struggle for yourself, to have figured it out for yourself. And I think the fact that we avoid using testimony in art, that we avoid experts, shows that our life with an aesthetic appreciation is really a lot like a game. right? The point is not to have the right answers. The point is to have gone through the struggle for yourself, to have tried to figure things out for yourself, to try to see for yourself, to try to feel things for yourself. Um,
So to
so
bounce off that right there, if you don't mind, there it's just a because I just want to say this, and I feel like it's just going to spur this to maybe another sentence or two of elaboration. But so there's again going through some of the things that you reference in your stuff. So there's like Richard Wollheim's acquaintance principle. There's Robert Hopkins' The Requirement, which both talk about like a right to an aesthetic belief. So you
right,
know the one being like you have to have actually experienced it to have a right to an aesthetic belief. And then the other one is, and this one is the requirement is even more kind of a lofty, being like it's not just having experienced the thing, but knowing like why you believe, like have an aesthetic belief about it, like being able to source it and not just be like, well, I feel like it's about, like, you know, watching The Emperor's New Groove and being like, I feel like this is about a father and son relationship. Just like, you know what I mean? Like you have to
yep,
be able to tie it to something observable or something.
right,
What do you think it means to have a right to an aesthetic belief?
right. So this is the interesting thing. Like, what's up for debate here is really the form of this. So why do people think it's a requirement? The reason is because you, at least some people feel this intuitive wrongness to making aesthetic claims without seeing it for yourself, right? So it just feels like this thing I was talking about before, right? Like where someone, okay, there are actually two related things that we should untangle. One is there seems to be something wrong about making this like conclusive judgment without having seen it for yourself. And the other is making this judgment. Sorry, hold on, give me a second. My brain's tangled. So there seem to be like two ways to do it wrong that a lot of us kind of like impulsively recoil from. One way of doing it wrong would be just to be trusting somebody else, right? Like you, my buddy knows an incredibly large amount about Italian horror, right? He tells me what are the greatest Italian horror movies. I don't even bother to watch them for myself. I just go around talking about the greatness of like this, you know, Dario Argento's films, even though I've never seen them. That would seem weird. Another thing that would seem weird, and this is what the new stuff is about, is if we figured out our aesthetic judgments for ourselves, but not by looking directly, but through something like scientific inference. So imagine if I do this. I'm at a show, Monet show, and you know there are 100 Monets there, and I look at the first 60, and I'm like, every one of these is moody and beautiful and shimmering. And someone says, okay, we should go to the next room for the next one. And I'm like, I don't need to see it. I know it is moody and brilliant and shimmering, right? So notice that I did that myself. And in some sense, it's kind of rooted in my own sensory perceptions. But it's weird because I've done it through like scientific inference, right? I've reasoned from a past sample into the future. And then I'm making this claim that, like, you know, Monet's water lily reflections under a bridge, which I've never seen, is just a genius. I mean, imagine I told you this, like it's a genius work. It is so moody. It is so deep. And they're like, how long did you look at it? I'm like, I've never seen it. I'm just inferring from past experiences with other Monets from that period, but it is so deep. Like that would seem fucking weird, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah. It's kind
the
of
thing that
reminiscent of also, sorry, just about the because I thought that example was interesting and strange and sticky and specific, and I didn't know if it like really fit as the counterweight to the like audio tour Brandon or whomever,
right,
and then the other was like what like Sally, who just watches movies and then by Humean and inductive reasoning starts to make like absolute claims
right,
about, you know what I mean, which wouldn't make sense in a scientific life, of course, is to
right.
expect repetition where it is, but like you say, that doesn't give you the right to an aesthetic belief somehow.
Right. Yeah, that's the. I mean, when people say this thing that sounds weird, like there's a requirement to do these things this way, or like you don't have a right to make an aesthetic claim without having seen it for yourself, right? What they're really getting at is this, like they're trying to elucidate this like sense we have that something has gone wrong or is deeply weird if I make
Mhm.
that kind of claim, right? So it's not like supposed to be like someone telling you on high that you can't do it this way. I
Right.
think like the thought is that basically almost all of us just would intuitively react this way if someone started making these claims like powerful, like I mean, but like okay, part of it is like the passion. So here's something. I My mother spent 8 months after the COVID vaccine came out refusing to take the COVID vaccine, right?
Mhm.
And I would passionately tell her, you have to take it. It will save your life. Like it is incredibly important. You must do it. I don't know shit about COVID science, right? I
Yeah.
don't know anything about how vaccines work. I don't know why this vaccines work, but I could declaim it with like total intensity and seriousness, right? With the maximum conviction
Yeah.
based on expert testimony, right? And we can't do it that in the art world. So why? What's this requirement? And the suggestion that so other people have tried to say, oh, that requirement is because of the nature of the kind of thing it is, like it's what it is in the natural world. Like there's some kind of weird subjective property that you have to feel for yourself. And
Mhm.
my suggestion is what we intuitively know, we intuitively understand the game likeness of the art world. And exactly in the same way, you don't need a theory of games to know that if someone's going to run the marathon and they take a taxi, they've done something wrong, right?
Yeah.
And it's not, and you intuitively know that if someone buys Portal and then looks at the walkthrough and finishes it in like 30 minutes, that they've done something wrong. You don't need a theory of games to know that, because I think all of us deep inside know that a game like Portal is there for the experience of figuring it out for yourself, not to have somehow finished it following someone else's, words.
Yeah.
And I
It's
think the
almost
same thing, like, so my theory is that our sense of wrongness here is because we understand what the game of art is for intuitively,
Mhm.
and we can see that there's a way of missing out on what it's for. So it's not like God is telling you you cannot do this. It's like, you know, the it's driven by an understanding that doing it by a certain constraint gets you to the valuable activity, right? And
Mhm.
I think, intuitively know what that value is.
Yeah, it's like that value, like it's like we're deducing a right to an aesthetic belief and deducing like the rules of the game like from a sense of value or a sense of
Right.
it not being there. It's like that's first, and then backwards we go to be like, oh no, you actually need to have the right to an aesthetic belief in order to access that value that we already know.
Right. Exactly. So one way to put it is my explanation is that the requirement to do it this way is grounded in the structure of a particular rule set, and the structure of that rule set is explained why we should obey those rules. It's not like arbitrary from on high. It's because obeying those rules gets you to a certain value. Like,
Mhm.
so for example, if I was entering marathons for exercise and then I took a taxi, like, you would know that I'd missed out on the thing I had wanted.
Yeah.
Interestingly for me, one of the really interesting things for me, and the reason that I like the game explanation for the activity, is that I think this requirement actually isn't true for everyone in all contexts.
Okay.
So I think, so the way back when, the earliest thing I wrote in this space, I think this is going to seem so stupid and tiny, but the
Okay.
thing that I noticed was that museum curators aren't subject to this requirement. So if you and I were in a museum together, just there looking at this Rococo art, right? And you were just looking at the guidebook and ignoring the Rococo art, I'd be like, fucking look, right? Don't ignore the expert, just look.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you're the museum curator and you're telling me, well, I've got a 10 million grant to spend to acquire certain things for the collection, and I don't know anything about Rococo art, I would say, find an expert,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Don't trust
Do
what you
not
think,
trust yourself.
right? Like, this, you have an important task of conservation, and we should put it at the right things. You and I don't know. We're just going to find an expert, right?
Mhm.
Similarly, I think like art historians do a similar thing. So one of the things you'll see is like, so I was reading this thing about how it becomes really clear that that Van Gogh's brushwork came from looking at a lot of Japanese woodcuts, especially Hokusai and Hiroshiga. And for people that know a lot about the history of Japanese art, it's incredibly obvious. Not everyone can see it, but people doing art history who want to say like, oh, Van Gogh was influenced in this way, they just defer to experts in Japanese painting to be able to see that this style of brushstroke transfers. Right. So my claim is that what's going on is that art historians and art curators are not playing a game. They're doing something else. They're actually doing something that's more like science. Right. They care about getting the facts right. That's what's important to them. And so if they want to get the facts right, they should defer. But for you and me at the museum, or you and me at the jazz show, or you and me at the rap show, right? Like that's not what we're doing. We're doing a different activity of aesthetic appreciation, and that's the one where you'll miss the point. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think like it's the Bernard Suits distinguished between so he calls it technical activity and game activity. So in technical activity, you're trying to get to a certain state because that state is important. And in game activity, you're trying to get to a certain state because that'll give you this interesting activity. So here's this great example where like, imagine both of us are climbing a mountain. And you're climbing the mountain because you want, there's a plant, a rare herb at the top that will cure your mortal illness. And I'm climbing it because I'm a mountain climber, right? I'm playing a game and you're not. And the way we can tell is if someone comes by with a helicopter and offers us a lift, you should say, hell yeah, right? I don't care about how I get up to the mountain. I just want this herb at the top that's going to cure my illness. And I will say, no, I'm a mountain climber. I'm not going to take the shortcut, right? Mm-hmm. And I think one way to put it is, the thing I'm trying to show is that it's not beauty itself, right? It's not elegance itself. It's not something in there that makes us have to ignore testimony. It's that there's different kinds of activities. The curator and the historian are like scientists. They're engaged in a technical activity. They want the facts. They want the knowledge. They want it to get there the best way they can. Art appreciators are game players, right? We don't want to get there the most efficient way we can because the most efficient way we can will involve deferring to experts. And what we want is to do things for ourselves.
Right. I think I have like a two-part question attached to that. Let's see if I can kind of fuse them together. The one is that you use that term throughout autonomy and aesthetic engagement, of course. You swallow a lot of different activities under art appreciation. And so how consciously was that term chosen as opposed to like art critique? And like the reason I'm asking with like this art historian thing and these different motivations and the difference between like a striving game and a technical task and such is like, does good taste exist?
Right.
As because the Humean like thought of like taste is to like acquire like aesthetic knowledge about a thing, which is more similar to like kind of what the art historian is, where testimony kind of matters a lot, or like being right. People actually want to be right. Like, yeah, does good taste exist to you in that fashion? I think, sorry, there's a lot wrapped up in it because I'm mixing too many questions because you touched too many interesting points. Because another one is also that you mentioned in one of your papers, like that you play piano, and like that has given you like a new kind of access to some of these to like the difference between Chopin and Beethoven, right? Or like, being familiar with something and its conventions and what conventions it's obeying or not gives you like deeper aesthetic engagement. So yeah, like, is that taste? Like, does that taste exist? And like, is that different? I'm sorry, you're a philosopher. You can untangle what I'm saying, right?
I know you're asking. So, I mean, in some sense, the entire discussion I'm having is premised on the possibility of aesthetic experts and some people knowing more. And the interesting puzzle is like, why would you avoid just following the people that know more? But I really do think it's possible to know more or have a more valid opinion in art, right? But it's weird because in the art world, it's possible for some people to know more, and yet we kind of want to ignore them. That's the weird puzzle. Mm-hmm. But I mean, Okay, the art world is a little bit different because I think we tend to get total convergence over time in scientific experts. We don't in the art world. But I think it's so. I do this with my aesthetic students. We actually read Hume on the standard of taste,
Yeah,
which is one of my favorite papers. And
mine
Hume
too.
says this stuff about how, yeah, they're just people that are aesthetic experts whose views are, in the colloquial sense, more valid. And my students are always going to be like, no, no way. And you just can run examples. So, for example, what if I came up to you and I said, oh my God, you have to hear this new rap album. It's amazing. Drop everything, listen to it. And you're like, how much rap have you listened to? I'm like, I've listened to Hamilton and nothing else.
This is very pertinent. I don't know if you know that I'm a rapper and like hip hop artist.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it's cutting deep. I did theater. I was also like in an arts high school, like an audition arts high school too. And I have had like the visceral experience of someone being like, check this out. You're gonna love this. And it's like Eminem's Rap God that just dropped in like 2015 or whatever. And I have to be there and be like, I'm sorry. I know like your subjective reaction to this is valid, and no, like
right.
in the Hume thing, like no one has to. All sentiment is correct, but there's some aesthetic knowledge that I have that you don't, that I think is more objective than that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is what's really interesting. So, okay, this is the whole thing. This is what makes this super interesting to me. So let's go back for a second. By the way, quick story. The angriest I've been aesthetically, by the way, my spouse tells me that I'm a much more aesthetic person than moral person. Like aesthetic stuff will make me much angrier. Yeah. But I have, I love Kanye. This is my spouse recently told me that the second best thing that I brought into our life was our children. The first best was introducing her to Kanye. So I love Kanye.
Yeah, it's dripping. I mean, you can't stop mentioning it when you're writing about serious academic things.
So good. But also, like, I mean, I'm also, part of it is also just, part of the audience that I'm writing to in philosophy are people that convinced that, they're still convinced that, ballet and classical is one thing, but then, and maybe there's some very respectable hip hop that's like very obviously politically progressive, but like, right. Anyway, so, so I'd been trying to convince a friend to listen to Kanye and they kept like rejecting it out of hand. And then one day they came to me like, oh my God, I have like, there's this rap. It's so good. You have to listen to it. You will love it. And then they played me fucking Hamilton. And I wanted to like,
it's irritating. So, yes.
Right. So if someone has never listened to any rap, but like, or like their first exposure to rap is like Macklemore's Thrift Shop, and they're trying to like explain to you that like, right. They don't have the background experience to see all the details of the complexity. I mean, any aesthetic realm you love, that the more time you spend in it, the more details you can see, the more resonances you can see, the more of what's actually there you can see. So this, I mean, one of the things, Hume has all these other really interesting claims, like, okay, so when I work with my students about this, like, I'm like, okay, imagine my mother says that any movie that has any gay person involved in it is bad. You would not accept her view, right?
Yes.
Or would you accept the view of someone who had texted through an entire movie, right? And so he actually ends up saying, like, here's what it is to be an aesthetic expert. It's to have experience in a realm. It's to have the capacity to pay attention instead of just being distracted. And it's the capacity to know what your biases are and register or avoid them. I mean, part of what he says is like, what it is to be an aesthetic expert is to have fewer biases. And I think this is, so one of, I was thinking about this a lot because I think, so I was a food critic for a long time. And I think one of the reasons I'm good as a food critic is that I have low food nostalgia. I think people that really strongly react to food and love it more if they grew up with it aren't as fair food critics, right? Or I think something like either someone that has low nostalgia or knows when the nostalgia is active, right? And can ignore their nostalgic views, right? That person would make a better food critic. So I mean, one thing that happened to me when I was a food critic was, I mean, I'm also a climber, and sometimes I would go to a place and I'd be like, this is so fucking good. I'd be like, oh, it's because I've just climbed for 2 days.
Yeah.
I should not write a positive review based on a place I just ate at right after I climbed. Like
Yeah.
that might be biased.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things, one of the reasons your question is super interesting, there are different activities that seem to have different norms. And there are one, the appreciative context, when we're like sitting around trying to enjoy something, talk about it as appreciators, that seems the one where we want people to be the most independent, right? We're like, in some sense, even if you're deeply wrong, I want you to think things through on your own, right? That's the aesthetic world. The art curator, like the art curator who's trying to pick what should be saved, right, and conserved in limited resources, that's the person where I think we care the least about them thinking through things through for themselves. Like we care that they get it right, that they listen to experts if they need. And I think one of the things I didn't talk about the art critic is the art critic is this really interesting in-between position, because in some sense, I think there are more standards of getting it right for the art critic. I mean, we still want the art, interestingly, I think we still want the art critic to see things through for themselves, but we also care really deeply that they're not biased. Like that position is a certain kind of social power. And because of that social power, I think it's more important that, so for example, you don't want an art critic that was only raised on European cuisine and only prefers the things they were raised on, right? You want someone that is less biased than that in that position. So the normative standards are a little different. I think part of what's going on is the appreciator kind of can be in their own little bubble, like to the extent that there aren't downstream social consequences to like you and me sitting around talking about what our favorite kung fu movie is, right? Then we can be the most free from standards of correctness. And that I think really matters. So talking about the appreciator, I think was really important to me because that's the place where we most keenly feel the freedom from the standard of getting it right. The more we need to get it right, the more pressure we have to listen to experts and do science.
Okay, I have another two questions. um, I feel like I want to go back to that appreciator thing. I'm going to leave that for after this one. But first of all, you having experience as a food critic, um, is there meaning? Is there potentially an issue in conflating like a critic and like a reviewer? Like you said, right? Because I don't even know how to say. Like, because when you're describing like that, having just done a bunch of rock climbing and you're sweaty and you're tired and you eat a burger and you're like, this is the best fucking burger I've ever had in my entire life. Like, is there, I don't know, like some meaning to like a difference between like the subjective thing of writing like your little cutesy Yelp review that was like, if you go rock climbing in this area, if you're starving, this is perfect like satiation. Like, here's my subjective experience, and that's just data for you to use inductive reasoning to have, right? Like versus a critic where it's like there's this thing where you want to be free of sentiment, access some kind of aesthetic truth, as slippery as that is, but like as clear as it is by our like quality sense of like what's wrong and what is aesthetic and what isn't aesthetic. Like, is there a difference between a review and a critique?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this incredible range of activities that people tend to push together, and I actually think they're really different because of these different normative standards on them. It's like, so when I was talking about how important it is to be debiased as a critic, I was thinking in particular of someone that had a platform, right? The larger your platform, the more crucial this is. Like Yelp reviews are a different standard, partially because no single person has that much power on Yelp. I think but we do these different things. I think it's a great example to be like, okay, I mean, I actually remember this in SoCal. There was this like fried, like this like very San Diego style, like SoCal fried potato and cheese burrito place. And I literally, it was a surfer hangout, and I have never eaten there except after having spent all day in the ocean and being starving. And I think all the Yelp reviews are like, this is awesome after surfing all day. This is awesome. And I think that is a really great data point. But there's something else that we seem to care about. Um, so, I mean, art critic and reviewer are really interesting terms. So I haven't thought a lot about this. I know a lot of people who have, and I think one of the things that they say is that the reviewer's main job is to deliver an overall evaluation, right? Thumbs up, thumbs down, how many stars, or even if there's not a summary, there's still a general need to say, should you go to this or not? Like the reviewer is providing a curation or a guidance service telling you what to do. Critics don't necessarily need to do this, right? A literary critic can just try to interpret the work without even rendering any judgment. They can just try to provide some kind of like linkage of concepts or expose something that's going on and just leave it up to you to decide for yourself how it is. So a lot of people end up, I think one of the things that happens is these get mixed up a little. So I think these two functions, some people like, so I think some reviewers online in some places, they take their main job as being telling you whether you'll like it or not. And other reviewers, I think, for example, like the New York Times A.O. Scott is a great reviewer who does this mixture of both this kind of critical interpretive work and this recommending work. So there's huge variation. Sorry, that feels like really fuzzy to me, but like I feel like there are different functions.
No, that's not fuzzy at all. I was just staring with a glowing pride at how tied it is to the writing that I've done, and like I was actually just glowing with pride in that moment. It's funny. I actually just spaced out for a second. I was just like, my life is awesome. I'm glad I get to talk to you about this, and that like some of the things I was thinking can be validated by someone that thinks the same way. Because when you're making a YouTube video, sometimes you are just inside of your own head, just completely. You know what I mean? For a lot of it, or I am.
Here's something that you might find interesting.
Yes.
Because you said this resonates with you. One of the things that I think, one of the reasons I was really, so there's this approach to aesthetic properties in this debate that I think is really metaphysical, where they say like all these requirements and rules come from how beauty is itself. And I think that can explain this huge variation and the huge between how we relate to things like to aesthetic testimony and deference. And that's because of what explains the variation is how we're doing, how we are performing different roles that are involved in different activities, and the rules change between the activities because they're different activities with different expectations. So here's an example I thought of. So tell me if you think this is interesting or not. I think a lot of us change the rules very quickly and very fluidly, and how people expect us to behave depends on what role we're playing. So imagine that I'm a museum curator. I'm supposed to be unbiased, right? I'm supposed to pick things ignoring my particular relationship to the artist, right? So in that role, I'm supposed to strictly remove any like nepotism. And then I go home and I'm a parent, and my 5-year-old has just made like a finger painting. And I turn to someone like, this is the best thing ever. And I'm just glowing with pride.
Yeah.
That is a fully biased judgment, but I think because it's being rendered in my role as a parent and not a curator, it's okay. I think we slide between these things all the time. So my friend Matt Stroll, who's a philosopher of art, has this wonderful book called Why It's Okay to Love Bad Movies. And he thinks that one of the things we're doing when we're watching like crappy movies is we're engaging in this communal act of coming up with the nuttiest and zaniest interpretation we can. Right. And that's like a different role. I think if you're like the New York Times reviewer of record, you don't want to do that with a movie. That would be kind of unfair, right? You want to try to stay true to the movie. But then if you go home with your friends and get drunk and watch The Core and come up with like the reading where The Core expresses like the Derrida's theory of like communication, that's great because you're so engaged in a different activity with different norms. Yeah. And we understand what we're doing there. We understand that we've shifted normative landscapes.
Yeah, it's I don't know, it's a little bit adjacent to the like object art, process art thing as well, right? Where it's like the like when you like of course when you go home and you're like are saying like looking at your kids like painting and being like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life. Like there's kind of like an art to parenting, you know what I mean? Like a different set of expectations to achieve like this again, like that sense of like high or low value, like from which we're deducing all this fractal insanity, right?
Let's go back to the striving process thing, because I think that's a really interesting connection. So for your audience, so I think there's a cluster of concepts.
For me too. I just read this like today, okay. So I actually.
Awesome. So a bunch of things. So first, let's go back to games. So I think there's an important distinction in games between what you can call achievement players and striving players. So achievement players play to win, and striving players temporarily take on an interest in winning for the sake of the struggle itself. And for me, the most interesting category is what I want to call aesthetic striving play, which is you try to win not because you care about winning, but because temporarily getting excited about winning will get you buried in this beautiful process, this process of doing, right? Next door to this is this idea. When I was reading a lot about games, I kept seeing people do this thing where they would talk about video games and emphasize the movie-like aspects of them. They would emphasize the fixed script, the graphics. And I think it was because they were bringing this paradigm and this conceptual framework where they were looking for fixed features in the game. They couldn't talk about how it felt for you as the game player, because if you were doing criticism about a game, you needed to talk about things that were in the game. And I think what's happening here is they're basically two very different kinds of artwork. And a lot of the times people miss out about games because they have them in the wrong category. So the two categories are, I call them object art and process art. So object art is art where the aesthetic qualities are in the object the artist made. And process art is where the artist makes an object and then the audience interacts with that object. And then the aesthetic qualities come out in the audience member's own actions and qualities. So basically, to de-abstract, movies, books, paintings, music, those are object arts, right?
You say also live performances too, though, right?
Live
like
performances
theater,
are object
because
art.
it's still an object.
It's still an object. Yeah. When I say that it's beautiful, I'm talking about something outside of me, right? I'm talking about it's like Kanye's rap that's like hysterical and devastating, right? It's Joanna Newsom singing that's like so like creaky and so. Yeah. I recently won a contest when people were like, between aesthetics professors, they were like, summarize the weirdness of your taste as briefly as possible. And I said, my favorite two living artists are Kanye and Joanna Newsom. And everyone's like, pretty good. Whoa. Yeah, there's my taste. There's me. There's my raw soul. Okay. So then there's another category I want to call process arts. And I think a lot of games are like this. The artist makes a game. And the most important thing is that when you play the game, it's you, the player, whose actions and decisions are beautiful or interesting or thrilling or dramatic. Mm-hmm. And so the process arts are this two-stage thing where there's an artifact, but then the artifact is provoking you into a kind of aesthetically rich action. Mm-hmm. And for me, there are other examples of this too, like improvised tango dancing, social food rituals like hot pot. Like a lot of what's going on, a lot of the aesthetic quality is in the actions and interactions of the audience members. Mm-hmm. So I think this is important because different arts have different relations. So, okay, maybe you'll find this interesting. Obviously, I think aesthetic appreciation is a process activity. It's a striving activity. It's something that you do for the sake of the engagement itself. What about the act of aesthetic creation? I think it actually varies.
I have the same thing written down.
What did you say?
I have the same thing written down. I was going to bring that up. Just like a lot of like the act of creating object art is almost always process art.
I don't think it always is. I think it sometimes is.
Right.
So as a classically trained pianist, I think a lot of classical piano is not designed for the process. Some of it is processy, but a lot of it is really like sacrificing like anything in yourself to deliver something to the audience.
It's so focused on that the identical recreation of the initial thing.
Where I think like jazz is often a process. Like the jazz not only produces something for other people to appreciate, but the process of playing jazz, of improvising, is itself a game-like, delicious aesthetic activity.
Yeah.
I think the clearest example of this is like ballet training. No one gives a shit in the art critical world how it felt for the ballet dancers. Like it probably feels awful often. That's not part of the experience, right? Where it feels like jazz is really tuned to be delightful for the players, to be interesting for the players and for the listeners. Another version of this, I think, is tabletop role-playing games. I think tabletop role-playing games generate a story, but also make a process of story generation that's delightful.
Right.
So like I listen to tabletop role-playing game podcasts, and it's fun for me as an audience member to hear the story that have all emerged, but also the process of story making has been engineered by the role-playing game to be entertaining for the role player. So now there's like 3 stops in this train, right? There's the game designer who wrote the role-playing thing, and that might be an aesthetically rich process. And then there's the players who play the game, which is also an aesthetically rich process, which outputs a third aesthetic object, which is the story, which is also appreciable on its own.
Yes.
Because I listen to, role-playing podcasts, and one of the funkier things is that good role players often create more interesting stories than what are available in the large corporate edifices that are pooping out
Right.
But
now that's its
major
own
films.
art object at the end of that process. And I want to double background to the first of that trifecta as well, because now you have like the process art and the object art and then there, but then you also have another kind of art object, which was the game designer, which brings me to someone that you reference quite a bit that I'm always highlighting the quotes of that you reference, but I just wanted to ask you about them. But Dominic Lopez or Lopes or Lopes, I don't know how to say
Lopez.
Lopez.
Yeah.
I knew someone with the same last name that was always Lopes. So anyways, so Dominic Lopez, who said a few things that I really like that I don't even know that I don't know if I remember or why I brought it up. Okay, so he was talking about how like he argued maybe slightly counter to your like you brought it up as like a counter argument to your idea of process art. Where he was like, no, the art is still the object, and then the process is just how you're engaging with it, like how you would walk around like a sculpture to see it from different angles, the same way you like engage with a game, or like like I don't know, like the rock climbing wall is maybe the art, or and then and what and the who is this? Is this a person you know?
Yeah, Don Lopez is this incredible philosopher of art.
Because he says great stuff.
Yeah, he's a senior figure. He's probably among the most important of the people in the philosophy of art. He also mentored me and like a lot of the current generation of kind of like younger philosophers. Or I mean, it's funny, like I'm 45, and I think in the world of philosophy, that means you're like a young professor, because
right?
Like, the process of getting your PhD is so long. So Dom is from like a generation above me, and he really pioneered a lot of this work. He wrote this book called The Philosophy of Computer Art, which I'm responding to. And he has this, I mean, his work in general is amazing. And his new stuff is really interested in what he calls aesthetic network theory. So he thinks that, and I totally agree with him about this, that most people in the philosophy of art have tried to look at the value of art strictly in terms of the audience's encounter with artworks. Like it's just the end product relationship. And he thinks, no, to understand the value of art, we have to look at the whole community and the network of artistic actors and think about the value across the differential value across the whole network. And so he's talking about, he thinks, what is the value of looking at the art? What is the value for the people that are doing the curation? What's the value for the people writing the criticism? What's the value in the activity of the people that like hang the paintings in museum? Yeah. What's the value of in the world of classical music? Then there's the entire world of the people that make violins and like instruments, like, and what's the value of composition? So there's this vast network of things. And what Dom's really pushing for, that I 100% agree with, is that when you're talking about the value of art, you have to talk about the value of all of those activities across the board.
Yeah.
I've occasionally had a thought that, I mean, if you just thought that art was for the pleasure of the appreciators, then we would never need to make new art. There's enough fucking art. You could spend your entire life. Like there's so much, you just pick one thing, like literally you could pick jazz. I know people that do this. You could pick jazz in the 50s and there's enough recording. Yeah. You could pick New York jazz in the 50s and there's enough recorded music to make you happy for your life, right? Yeah. You could pick like video games in the 90s and there's enough there, right? You could spend your whole life digging through one decade of video game production. There's enough there for pleasure. what's the point of making new art? I think actually a lot of it is so that not only is there stuff for the audience, but there's a place for creators. There's a place for critics. Like it's incredibly valuable to be in all these slots. So in my life, one of the most exciting things I got to do, I realized retrospectively, in I spent a decade of my life posting heavily on this site called Board Game Geek, um, which is this online review area and forum about board games. And I realized what we were actually doing retrospectively is that we were developing an aesthetic critical language, an art critical language about games. We were trying to come up with the right terms to describe certain interesting features about the mechanics. Right. We were trying to come up with the language to talk about why this game was, without just importing it from previous bits of fiction.
Yeah.
And I think it's awesome to get to be a part of that. And if you didn't have live art, then you might have stuff to look at, but you wouldn't get to participate in the act of creating a new genre and coming to have the aesthetic language to have that genre, right? Mm-hmm. So all that stuff, I think, is one of the reasons that we like creating new genres and styles, is so that there are all these slots for us to occupy, not just as audience members, but as critics and creators and curators, right? That's a rich form of life for a lot of people.
Yes. I mean, it's a thing of tremendous value that can be interacted with in many ways. I mean, that's one of the main thrusts of like, and because, anyways, I don't want to talk too much about like my work. Obviously, I'm kind of more interested in just.
Oh, tell me about your work. It's interesting.
Well, I come from a little bit of a more like, it's the form of my things are obviously not like academic. I was in jazz school and then I dropped out because YouTube started working out. Never did philosophy. I was always told I was like good at it, but I never found something that gripped me. And all the aesthetic philosophy that you're like fed, I think at first is all dog shit. So it took until like of the standard of taste and doing my own research independently to arrive at my own things. And so it's orbiting around, frankly, you. I really like some of the things that Dominic Lopez has said so far, and Robert Pirsig's Metaphysics of Quality and Zen of the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Lila. So anyways, sorry. So like there's, but I'm also then communicating it to like an audience, right? Sure. And doing it kind of free form, and also following like as an artist myself too. And like I'm Christian. I'm like religious, but in a kind of radical way. And I'm just an intense person, and I want to change the world. Okay. So anyways, there's a lot of embracing of the irrationality of trying to reconcile the irrationality of some things and like the passion of some things with the rationality of things, as well as like just subjectivity and objectivity. Something that Pirsig does very well, which is like quality or value is the actual like inciting event from which we deduce subject and object. So then the thrust for me in art in like a similar way is art is this emergent property, and the reason you can't contain it and we can keep endlessly defining it and like breaking it up like that is because it's like art is an interaction. You know what I mean? It's a moment. It's like an event that we can like sense with like our feelings, but it's accessible in so many different ways. That's why it's not just art objects or even art processes, or we can elevate even like, the act of parenting into an art form. And that's why we have that like colloquial language. So that's what I'm like doing there. But I'm just saying it fits snugly with, I don't know how you articulate it, or how Lopez says it. What is it? A network of aesthetic.
Yeah. Actions and actors.
Network of aesthetic actions and actors.
Yeah.
Very cool.
This is actually apropos. Do you want the new theory? Because it actually connects to what you were just saying.
I very much do. I want to hit one more point before we do the new theory.
Okay.
That's probably bullshit. I could ask you.
Hit me with a point.
Okay. Okay. So another one. This is about the. Okay. Wait. Let me just. Fun. You did that. That's a little bit redundant. It's just a good quote from a video essayist, musician, a friend of mine. The act of establishing a rule or convention in regards to art or artistic practice will necessarily result in the implicit formulation of an equal and opposite anti-convention, which is like Kendall Walton's categories of art and Yuriko Saito's artistic prescriptive practice. There's not even like a question there. It's just data. And I was like, maybe you'll have a question. Okay. Dominic Lopez's. I'll just ask about this one, and then we'll. Wait. Oh, fuck. Sorry. I remember the one.
Okay. Hit it.
Okay. Given your hypothesis that art appreciation is analogous to a striving game, you'd think that people would find just great productive value in arguing about who's right about a particular piece of art. But sometimes people get heated and extremely personal about it. And people can get so like that process of like art appreciation is not necessarily even like a pleasant one, or sometimes feels like it's not even a valuable one. Um, why do you think that happens?
I mean, in some sense, I think so. There are a few different things because, like, one way to look at it is I think getting too heated is often just a mistake about the activity. I mean,
Yeah.
the big theory I want to give you at the end is that maybe art is a place that we've made for the joy of disagreement, right? That it's a constructed place that instead of like science is a place where we try to like when we find a disagreement, we try to eliminate it, right? We try
Uh-huh.
to get everyone on the same page and converge. That's how science makes progress.
Uh-huh.
And I think in the art world, if everyone ended up with the same view, it would be like boring, right? Like art is a place where we've made it so we can disagree as much as possible. This is also part of the game theory, right? Games are constructed, delightful conflicts, right? We've
Right.
made a conflict that's interesting and we want it to last a while. Like you don't want to just solve the game. You want to keep having it be deep and rich and interesting.
Uh-huh.
So I think there's is um, one analogy is the people you're talking about feel like people to me that are too competitive in games. There's a space of being too competitive, which is getting the point. I mean, it's interesting to me because in order for a lot of games, in order to really experience what's good about them, you have to try really hard to win. But if we deep in our heart understand that we're trying to win just for the sake of fun, then we're not going to be too attached to losing or winning, right?
Mhm.
Like I think like the ideal striving game player is someone that tries really hard to win during the game because that's how you get the pleasures of the game.
Mhm.
But also whether they won or lost afterwards, it's like, great, we had an interesting time, right? They're
Mhm.
not like frustrated. So there's a sense in which you might be talking about something analogous in art appreciation. If you think art appreciation is not just a game of engagement, but a game of disagreement, where the point is that we can have these delightful
Right.
arguments, then getting too invested and too mad is like losing it when you lose a party game, right? It's like, that's one thing. But the other thing is, I think all that depends, what I said before, depends on the view that, um, depends on the view that it's this kind of art appreciation is kind of like game-like secluded environment that's devoid from the rest of the world. And I don't think that's always it, because I think, I mean, this idea that art is for this kind of open, appreciative game, I think that's only one value of art, and there are others. Like I think to the extent that art is a way for people to express feelings that are hard to express elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
Then that's real. That's about social power.
Mhm.
And that's a case where I think like you can get really, I mean, I think it's one thing to get angry because another person doesn't share your taste exactly. It's another thing to get angry because someone you're talking to has dismissed all black music and art and won't take
Mhm.
the words of any black artist
Right.
seriously.
Yeah.
Then we're in the realm of bias about communication, because I think art is for two things. Like art is both a place where you can do this delightful interpretive game, and it's a place where people try to communicate really deep and powerful things about their humanity and existence. And that is not a game. So weirdly, I mean, I think it has this like double, it has this double, there's this double meaning. And I think like there are different activities, they're responsive in different ways. And there's one thing we can do with art. Who the fuck cares about what the message in Godzilla versus King Kong was? That's not a a work rich in social meaning. Let us sit around and make up bullshitty, weird interpretations. That'll be fun. Do that there. And then, you know, if you're reading Audre Lorde's poetry, you should probably pay fucking attention to what she really means, because it's important. It's about the
Yeah.
world,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And that's a place where I think a lot of these, and you can see that I think a lot of the norms of freedom start to go away when we're talking about art as a way of communicating social meaning. I'll
Mhm.
I'll say things like that's where, like if if we're talking about, I don't know, the experience of an impressionist painting, uh, and I'm trying to guide students through it, then I let them talk about whatever. Like they can just say weird shit. It doesn't matter. They're exploring over there. And that's a great place for it.
Mhm.
If we're talking about like you know W.E.B. Du Bois's stories, which are expressing a very clear and important idea, and they like totally misinterpret it because they don't know the history, I'll be like, no, you're wrong.
Yeah.
You have to pay attention to the history to understand what's going on because we're in a different space now. Now, I think in this case, we're not playing an appreciative, interpretive game. We are doing something. We're doing something with real outcomes that we care about, which is
Mhm.
the communication of an experience that
Mhm.
needs to be understood for social and moral reasons. So this is why I think like we're at this nexus of different things that we're doing for different reasons, and we slide across them.
Ah, excellent. Need Needed that soundbite right there. That was so good. Exactly the conclusion that I come to at the end of that I'm like, because I didn't have quite the words for it. I was just struggling. I filmed it in three portions. I haven't filmed the fourth yet because I haven't quite arrived. But it's just germinating, and then that just did a lot for me because it's the difference of communication of experience as like an intentional thing and something with like
Yeah.
social power and something of like with meaning more than like aesthetic enjoyment if those are different kinds of meaning.
Yeah, I mean, just think that you can take particular communicative artifacts and you can interact with them in different ways. Like imagine Shakespeare wrote a love poem to a particular person. One way to interact with it is as appreciators of poetry hundreds of years later, right? Where we, you know, can do this interpretive game. There's not many stakes. But imagine that you're the recipient of the poem, the person that Shakespeare was in love with. You're reading it as a communication from a human being, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Or imagine you reading it as a biographer or historian. Each of these different relationships you can have to this set of words can lead you to interact with them in different ways because you're approaching them for different reasons. And
Hmm.
sometimes certain approaches are almost mandated. I mean, I think, especially for artwork that is trying to express something about unfair social relationships or power, we need to see them as communicative acts and not just do the appreciative game.
Mm. So I'm gonna. There's one more question before asking about thing. Thank you so much for taking time to do this. I hope it's been stimulating. Whatever. I was gonna ask about Lopez's aesthetic act,
Right.
which is the difference between an aesthetic act and like a non-aesthetic act is if you do it for aesthetic reasons, which all of this it's so true and so relevant, and you even expound upon it a little. I mean, the way you explain it also is like it's not even just to say like you can't like it's not even to say that like you can't do perform an aesthetic act in order to accomplish something else. You know what I mean? Like make this beautiful so someone has a good time, or make this dope so I earn money by selling it. But you still are making the choice based off of like your is it I think what you're saying is like on an individual innate sense of what is good or better. Um
But like, I mean, I do think this is really rough because we're back in the realm of like distinguishing the aesthetic and non-aesthetic. But I
yes.
don't. I mean, I think it's really important to distinguish between different kinds of goodness, right? I mean, and I think what you can say like, why did you write it that way? And I could respond, I wrote it that way because I think it was the most pragmatic way to convince people to be good. And I don't, that's a moral reason, not an aesthetic reason.
Uh-huh.
Versus I wrote it that way because I thought it would be thrilling and beautiful. Right. That is an aesthetic reason. Or I wrote it that way because I thought I would make money off of it. That's right. There are different kinds of goodnesses
Mm.
of which the aesthetic is only one.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. I think I'm arguing pretty explicitly counter
Yeah.
that. um,
I mean, you should look at Anne Eaton's paper, um, the Rough Heroes paper, called A Robust Immoralism, where she tries to identify a category of art that is aesthetically good because it's morally bad. Um,
So
and
wait, sorry, Anne Eaton. What's the name of the
Anne
thing?
Eaton, Eaton. She's one of the.
And what's the name of the particular property?
It's called a robust immoralism.
A robust immoralism. Okay.
So she's trying to argue. Here's her argument. You can pick it apart if you want. She's looking at things like The Sopranos,
Uh huh.
um, and she thinks in this case it is artistically amazing because they get you to identify. It has a very difficult artistic achievement of getting you to identify with a bad person.
Uh huh.
So to the extent it can get you to identify with it and like almost hero worship a
Mm-hmm.
bad person, and like even if you're like morally against it, get you to kind of love this bad person. That makes it morally worse, but aesthetically better. It's like artistically cool that it can
Right.
do this. And so you might take this as an argument
Yeah,
that
that's very compelling.
yeah, you can have different aesthetic. The achievement of making something evil beautiful is both artistically amazing and morally bad. And if
Yeah.
you can conceive of that difference, then those have to be different axes.
Yes. It's a good I mean, like with all of the how you've been describing aesthetics like throughout the entirety of this conversation, like getting like cleaner and cleaner with it. It's like aesthetics like you define it by its difference, right? Like if those exist independently of each other, then you know it for sure exists because otherwise what's in that space, right?
Right.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then I want to also just ask with the Lopez about what book specifically you pulled the aesthetic act from, and what's your main
Oh,
thing as a director?
that's his new book, Being for Beauty. It's really difficult. It's very technical. It's really important.
I read the freaking I did the Robert Hopkins epistemology, like usability and non-usability access of information through testimony and stuff. I think I could do it.
The Lopez is even harder.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Lopez is just it's a really hard book. It's
Okay.
amazing. I'm just warning you, it is really, really difficult.
Okay. I'll have it as like the thing that I
One thing that
do.
may interest you, so my friend Nick Riggle, who he and I are really working. Have you read any of his stuff?
No.
You would love his stuff. So he and I are the people really working this social value of art angle. So you'd be really interested in him. He wrote the paper you should start with. This is an incredible paper called Street Art: The Transfiguration of the Commonplaces, which is a definition of street art. And he basically says, he ends up saying, I love teaching this paper. He starts by saying, like, you might think that street art is art that's on the street, but that can't be true. Because if I'm moving a Van Gogh and I just leave it on the street, that's not street art.
Right.
And his definition of street art is art whose use of the street as a medium is intrinsic to its meaning. So the fact that it is made of public common stuff is part of what gives it the meaning it has. And in particular, he was interested in the fact that what it is to be on the street is to be in the public domain, and modifiable. So he thinks that an essential difference between the museum and the street is the museum is protected and the street isn't.
Right.
And part of what street art is that it's on public buildings and modifiable by people in the public. And he thinks when that becomes part of how it has meaning, when the fact that something has been scrawled over the side of a Whole Foods, or the fact that something is on a brick wall that anyone could paint over, when that becomes part of its meaning, then that's what makes it street art.
Right.
And I think part of the idea here is I think what a consequence for him is if you cut a Banksy out of a wall in the street and put it in a museum behind glass, you've destroyed the thing it is. It no longer has the meaning it has.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's Nick Riggle. So Nick characterized the landscape right now, philosophy of art. He said, okay, here's the major figures you might think of in the following way. So Karen Gordesky, her view is a basically Kantian subjective view. In the end, I mean, this is a gross oversimplification.
Yes.
But what makes art valuable and aesthetics valuable is a particular pleasure and a very specific kind of experience, a particular free experience of the senses. That's Karen's view. Dom's view is a very Aristotelian-y virtue and action view. That is, what makes art great is it enables all kinds of actions, and it enables all kinds of excellences. It
Mm-hmm.
enables people who are appreciating to be excellent perceivers, and people who are criticizing to be excellent interpreters, and people um, that are artists to become excellent artists. So it enables all kinds of rich human action, right? So you get a pleasure view, a excellence in action view, and then James Shelley's view is something like, no, art is just intrinsically valuable, and you have to see that value. It is intrinsic in basic value, just like the fact that human beings are valuable is a basic fact. The
Uh-huh.
fact that art is valuable is a basic fact. And if you miss that, you're missing the truth of the world. So one way to put it is that for Karen's view, in the end, the value of art is in something like pleasure. In Dom's view, the value of art is in virtuous, excellent action across all the actors in the network. And in James's view, the value of the art is in the art. Fuck you, it's not in you. I mean, one way to put it is,
Amen, brother.
so part of the view here in this fight. So it's funny. Between these views, James and Karen are these two people with these kind of opposite views that are very close friends in the same department, Auburn University. And I mean, one way to put it is, in the end, in this kind of like Kantian pleasure view, the capacity for art to be good is that it has a capacity to give us a certain kind of pleasure.
Right.
And if it doesn't, then it can't be good. And I think James Shelley's view is going to be something like, no, some art is great. If none of you take pleasure in it, you're fucking imbeciles and heathens. Learn the fact that if the world was such that no one understood the goodness of Kanye, the world sucks. Get better, people. Figure out. This is great art.
It sounds like I would really get along with James Shelley.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, I think it's really interesting, this constellation of views, which centers the value of art in like pleasure or activity, or just in the art itself as like a raw fact in the world.
Uh-huh. Man, I really wanted to pursue these like names that you've now dropped. Because I have the Anne Eaton, Robusta Moralism, Dominic Lopez for Being for Beauty, Nick Regal, is that what he said?
Nick Riggle. He has a bunch of new stuff that's really interesting. He has this view. He's trying to understand what aesthetic conversation is, and he thinks a lot of the mistake people make is thinking that it's the reporting of facts.
Mm-hmm.
This is this way. He actually thinks it's invitations to be together in something. So he's this very social theory. You would actually, what you should look at is, Nick Riggle has this book that is basically, it's a popular book, but it's basically Kantian aesthetics in disguise.
Okay.
And it's sold as a philosophical definitional account of the notions of awesome and sucking.
I love it.
There's an Aeon article that summarizes this briefly, but the book is really worthwhile. And here's how he puts it. He says, so he thinks that most of us, okay, you're going to love this. He thinks that most of us are most of the time in kind of like acting out roles and scripts. Like he thinks, so let's say I'm the customer, you're the barista, we have a script, we know how to interact. It makes things easy. We need to do this kind of thing. Yeah. He thinks that sometimes we break script. He calls this a social opening. And it's an invitation or opening for us to break out of our scripts and interact and appreciate each other as free, creative, full people. Uh-huh. He thinks to be awesome is to create, foster, encourage, and take up social openings. To suck is to crush them and mock them for no good reason. That's his theory.
Brilliant. What book is it? What's it called?
The book is called On Being Awesome.
On Being Awesome.
And I think he thinks that in the center of the place, awesomeness is larger than aesthetics, but I think he thinks that the place that you see that is the most potent place for breaking scripts and inviting each other to appreciate each other as free beings is with art and aesthetics.
Absolutely.
Like that's the center of awesomeness.
Yeah, that's why I make it. Like explicitly, I've always said, because these are gateways to like this hyper reality, where it's like you can just crack people. It's a whole field is dedicated to just crafting those moments of like hyper intimacy and like transcendence. And then James Shelley is the other person. Yeah. James Shelley, as they say it. Is there any particular book or paper, out of curiosity?
He's writing his book right now. Just read with Karen and James, they're both writing their great book right now. You basically have to read like the
You keep grouping them
past 5 or
together.
6 or 7 articles. What'd you say?
You keep grouping them together. So Karen,
Karen Gordesky.
Karen. Oh, that's not going to be easy to spell.
Um, Keren space Gorodeisky. I mean, they're grouped together because I kind of think of them as like the great figures, but also, I mean, Karen and James are kind of the headliners at Auburn University, which is,
gotcha.
I think, because of them, generally considered the best philosophy of art department in America because they're there.
Okay, dope. Sorry, I'm just extracting recommendations and information out of you now. But I promise you, this is to a good cause because I do have an audience, and this will be excitedly disseminated to a bunch of like queer teenagers, which is cool. They don't normally pay attention to everything. So beautiful. Okay, cool. Okay, thank you for all of your time. I don't want to press for even more, but would you be willing to give me a little bit about your new paper?
Yeah, let's do that, and then I'll finish, and then I have to eat some lunch and write a talk.
And pack.
Okay, what'd you say?
I said and pack. You have
and pack. I can pack in midnight. But I need my brain to write this talk. The talk is on reframing epistemology as a study of manipulation. So yes.
That's so funny because we haven't even touched on the whole like social stuff because I've done my own stuff on Twitter and like different like systems and incentives and stuff like that. And you have so much good work on it.
What did you say?
And you have so much good work on it.
Thank you. I mean, I should say that, I mean, I am one of the few people working across these two fields. Philosophy of art and aesthetics is one, and social epistemology, the study of how knowledge is created in a social environment, is the other. And I think they're a natural fit because social epistemology is about the transmission and recording of information in social groupings. And art is how we communicate subtle shit. Art is our deepest form of communication and expression. And in many ways, I think the study, aesthetics and the philosophy of art, is a particular study in the different capacities for expression of different of different technologies of communication, right? Like good aesthetics is about what's special about street art. What can that communicate? What's special about paintings? What can that communicate? My work has been like, what's special about games? What can games communicate that nothing else can because of what the special thing they are? And so when I was trying to write about Twitter, did you ever read my piece about Twitter called Twitter, the Intimacy Machine?
Yes. Okay.
That was the piece where the thing that helped me understand Twitter was a aesthetic theory of jokes, because the aesthetic Ted Cohen's theory of jokes is about the communicative potential of very short snippets. Anyway, sorry. So let me tell you about the new.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing. For my, I think I'm gonna upload this entirety thing like onto Patreon and then use clips for the stuff like the public thing. But so for anyone watching this, if you haven't already been entirely convinced of this, go look at everything Nguyen says about like games and stuff like games and like Twitter and like justice and the reductiveness of like particular gameplay stuff like that, because I know that my audience is going to be obsessed with that. I did that once. They always want me to talk about it more, but I'm more focused on aesthetic philosophy now. Right. So go watch it. Anyways, please. Yes.
Yeah. If you can put it, I think if people in your audience want to hear about the stuff about gamification and the simplification.
You have that lecture.
Yeah, I have the lecture. I think it might be worth linking to the Ezra Klein podcast. I showed up and talked about gamification. And I think that was a particularly clear, I did a good job that day.
Okay, cool.
Explaining that stuff.
Good to know your own judgment of your own articulation.
Okay, so here's the view. So there's this second weird part. So far I've mostly been talking about this thing we do in art where we don't defer to experts. But there's this other thing where we don't infer scientifically. This thing I was talking about like, oh my God, there's like 50 Monets. I see them and then I infer a scientific judgment about all the rest without looking at them. Yeah. That seems weird. Why don't we allow scientific inference in this area? So my explanation is you could totally do it. And in fact, people do, historians do it, right? Curators will do it. And in fact, here's something interesting. Dan Kevin Taylor, philosopher of art, blew my mind when he pointed out that in the art world, we do aesthetic inferences all the time. So aesthetic inference is making a prediction from past data about the future. Artists do it. How else would a jazz musician know what next note to play? How else would an oil painter know where to put that, especially in any kind of form where you can't go back, like, you know, oil painting, live jazz performance? You have to be making decisions because you know that this kind of thing will make it beautiful based on your past experience.
Mhm.
So we're actually doing scientific inference all the time, but we don't do it as appreciators. We think, oh, we have to look at each thing anew. Why? Same example as the last time, same answer as we talked about in the beginning. I think it's a game. I think it's a rule. I think actually what's going on in appreciation is we've adopted two rules. Don't use testimony, don't use scientific inference.
Mhm.
And the reason is those two rules together are what we need to plunge us into kind of individual sensuous activity, right? So if you didn't have the no testimony rule, you would just defer to experts. If you didn't have the no inference rules, you would gather a small sample, generate a principle, and then stop looking. You need those two rules together to force you to look at each individual thing anew, which is what we want.
Mhm.
So the big question for me is, why do we want it? And here's my thought: because life with science is really painful, right? Like, in some ways, science is amazing, but what science forces us to do is in many ways stop thinking for ourselves. Because of the size of the sciences, because of the specialization of the sciences ask us to trust things we don't understand, to trust evidence that we haven't seen with our own selves. Science asks us to kind of get out of ourselves and stop seeing things for ourselves, right? And this is not bad. This is what we have, because the world is more complicated than one brain, right?
Mhm.
The way for limited, tiny human beings to approach the massiveness of the world is to build this huge collective endeavor of people networked together to understand something that is way bigger than what one human being or a 10,000 human beings could understand on their own. So we have to do this because the world is more complicated than us, but it hurts because you can't understand everything for yourself,
Mhm.
because you have to give up intellectual autonomy, because you have to trust things beyond your understanding, and you have to give up using your own senses because, right, your senses are being defeated by information that's been gathered by hundreds of thousands of sources across time that's been compressed together. um, so I think that art is a practice that we've built to give us shelter from the pain of science.
Fascinating. And that's the thrust of your latest piece?
Yeah, it's called, I think the current working title is Art as a Shelter from Science.
Hmm.
That science is built to get us efficiently to information and knowledge, and the efficient path involves creating this vast network of experts and deferring to experts and creating these generally usable principles that we can use to make really quick predictions.
Mhm.
But all of that tears us away from the joys of individual perception and individual interpretation, individual understanding, or small group, just with your friends, interpretation and understanding. And so I think the norms, I mean, in general, what I think is that the world is massive and overwhelming, and games are little right-sized activities. Like, what it is to play a game is to make a little space where you can do something, you can get traction because the problems are hard enough for you to solve. And I think art is a space, a game-like space, where we've done the same thing for our perception and cognition. We've created a space where we get to play on our own and get to have opinions on our own instead of having to trust a vast, incomprehensible network of millions of experts outside of us.
It's kind of like a really heavy restatement of just like the folk wisdom of like science is how we live and art is why we live, you know?
Yeah.
Just way denser. Um, okay, amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This has been like nourishing beyond words for me and very invaluable. I really sorely appreciate it and all the resources and you staying on a lot longer. You really have no idea how much it means to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Good luck on figuring out something to say for the thing.
Okay.
Okay.
See you
Bye.
later.